annual dialogue, Parky Synagogue dialogue with our friend, Dr. Richard Haass, the distinguished president of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's really our first virtual. Otherwise, we have a full house at the synagogue where, Richard, you have been praying and speaking for how many years?
Interestingly enough, 18 high years.
Yes, it coincides with your unbelievable record as the president of the Council of Foreign Relations. And now I don't talk as a Parkist leader, as an old veteran of the Council of Foreign Relations. Anyhow, we're very honored because Richard Haass is not only a diplomat, served 4 presidents of the United States, confirmed as an ambassador by the United States Senate, and you had no problems getting the unanimous consent.
Few problems.
All right. Special envoy to Cyprus, and we can talk about that because of Turkey now and Greece, the tensions. And above all, a very original creative thinker who has written 14 books, including the latest, The World, an introduction, a bestseller. And finally, I have more to say about many of his public service accomplishments, but Dr. Haass, may God give you many, many years to apply your wisdom because you're really an anchor in terms of international relations, a source of hope, and we need that today. Welcome. So my first question, you and I are Zooming from our residences, right?
Yes, sir.
Not in our historic landmark synagogue. And I must tell you, being there myself in violation of guidelines on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, very painful to see a sanctuary that's usually full with so few people. But we are connected, and you are connected. So my question to you is, every aspect of life has been affected. Whether it's at home, whether it's education, whether it's the economy, whether it's the large, over 1 million people dying, everything has been affected. To what extent has that also impacted, for good or for bad, on international relations?
Well, it's a big first question. I'll get to it in about 30 seconds. First, Shana Tova. And it's good to see you. For the record, my tenure at the council, which is now year 18, is what? It's not even 50% of yours at Park East. So I've got a long ways to go. Not that I think I will ever compete with you. Look, this pandemic has had a terrible impact. You mentioned 1 million lives lost around the world, 200,000 or more in our own country. Tens of millions of people out of work, unemployment is high. Lives disrupted. Every aspect of life, personally, professionally, socially disrupted. The historic impact, though, is an interesting question. My own sense is probably less than people think. Sooner or later, we will figure out a way to manage, not eradicate, but manage this virus through wearing of masks, through other behaviors, through better testing, through therapeutics, through vaccines. We will find a way not to die from it, but to live with it. That will come. The economy will gradually recover. Although certain businesses will never come back, but new businesses will be created. Schumpeter's cycle, his churning will happen. In terms of international relations, my own view is ultimately a lot of what was visible and evident before the pandemic will be visible and evident after the pandemic. US-Chinese relations were deteriorating and difficult before. They'll be deteriorating and difficult afterwards. US-Russian relations were difficult. They will remain difficult. The Middle East, the dynamics have not, for the most part, change. North Korea's nuclear challenge, Iran's nuclear challenge, climate change. I could go around the world. But for the most part, the world will be recognizable once it essentially, I'm talking about maybe a year and a half from now. I actually think this will not, the pandemic will not be transformational, will not be a turning point in history. Probably what it has done is accelerated certain dimensions of history, it's accentuated them. But for the most part, I think the world will be all too recognizable.
Basically, what you're saying, it's my firm conviction that particularly as a Holocaust survivor, every crisis comes, every conflict comes to an end. 100-year war, 30-year war, World War I, World War II, and that's true for pandemics too, or 9/11. We emerged, right? My question to you is, in what way, what's your future prediction? How are we going to emerge of this?
Look, the optimist in me would like to say that the world will learn a lesson from this. The world will once again learn that what happens anywhere doesn't stay there.
Mhm.
What began in Wuhan didn't stay in Wuhan. This is the reality of globalization of modern life. Ideally, the world would improve the machinery of global health, the World Health Organization, other measures domestically and internationally, because the only thing we know for sure, Rabbi, is that one day there will be a COVID-22 or a COVID-25 or a COVID-28. One day, God forbid, there could be the emergence of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics on a large scale. That could happen. So this pandemic was predictable. Many people predicted it. Bill Gates, even someone like me who's not an expert predicted it. And I can predict future pandemics. I'm not smart enough to know exactly when or what the infectious mechanism is, but it'll happen again. The real question is, will we learn from this? Will we come together? And so far, the evidence isn't very good. The United States has left the World Health Organization. It's not clear to me that institutions like the WHO can reform sufficiently. Great powers are always wary of international agencies that have too much authority. It's true of China, it's true of the United States, it's true of Russia. People wrap themselves in sovereignty. So I am not confident. What's interesting though about this is that we've seen a tremendous variation in response. We've seen some countries succeed remarkably well, some have done terribly. What's interesting is it doesn't divide up. We've seen democracies do well and democracies do poorly. We've seen authoritarian systems do well and do poorly. What this shows to me is quality of leadership really matters. And there will be a lot of lessons to be learned, really obvious lessons about what it takes to prepare for pandemics, what it takes to manage pandemics. And the real question is, are we prepared to take these lessons and then introduce them into our policy?
Yes, but that requires leadership.
Indeed.
And I don't know whether you saw the last issue of The Economist. Governments throughout the world are having difficulty managing. And my question to you is, and this is a time when you at the Council of Foreign Relations, you meet with all the world leaders. So you have a good sense of how they feel in terms of difficulty leading their nations and the lack of faith and the lack of trust in government. How do you overcome that? And what is the cause of it?
The way you overcome it is with competence. And what's interesting is trust in government has gone up in those societies where government has performed. You see it in parts of Europe, such as Germany. You see it in South Korea and Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. You see it in Vietnam. So you see there trust in government has gone up. And in places like Brazil, Mexico, the United States, India, trust in government is going down. So it shows to me that where leadership is competent, where it does the right things, and also it's not enough as a leader to do the right thing. One of the lessons I've really learned from this crisis in running my own much more modest institution, the Council on Foreign Relations, it's never enough just to do the right thing. Every step of the way, you've got to explain. To lead in many ways is to have a conversation. You know, one of the great presidents in American history was FDR. One of the reasons he was so great was he didn't just do the right things, but through his fireside chats, he educated, he explained. He had a open-ended conversation with the American people. And I've actually come to conclude that one of the hallmarks of a good leader is someone who is willing to have an open-ended conversation with the people this person represents, who he must ultimately work for and with. And when you look around the world, some of the leaders who have done best, it's not just performance, it's a willingness to explain.
Now, do you have any good news on the world scene? Like, for instance, we are needing good news. What's your explanation for the outcome of the Bahrain and the
Sure.
agreement between Israel and that's a positive development, because I must say that even the Arab League did not oppose it. So what caused this change in attitude?
Look, there's a couple of pieces of good news. I'll get to that in a few seconds. I think there's good news in some ways in Europe. We've seen a revival of the European Union. And yes, I know the criticisms of the European Union, but the entire European project is one of the great accomplishments of the last 75 years. People often overlook the fact that Europe was ravaged by 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. One of the great accomplishments of the second half of the 20th century was to knit together Western Europe. Began as the coal and steel community, became the European community, became the European Union. And what we've seen since COVID is we've seen the European Union actually get stronger. Brexit turns out to be the exception in some ways rather than the rule. That's a good thing. We still have, for all of our problems with Russia, with China, again, unlike the first half of the 20th century, great power conflict we have great power competition. We have great power rivalry, but we're not having great power military conflict. I've studied enough history not to take that for granted. So I think there are some good things, despite, by the way, the health challenge we faced from COVID. The average person in this country lives 10 years longer than he or she would have lived 75 years ago. Around the world, the average person often lives 20 or 30 years longer. So we've made real strides in the last 75 years. So I think there's good news. Middle East, you say, right. What we've had in the last few weeks is the 3rd and 4th Arab countries have chosen to normalize their relations with Israel, to accept Israel, to open up normal diplomatic relations. Why did this happen? I think there's a couple of reasons. One is obviously the enemy of your enemy. In some cases, can be your friend. In this case, shared concern about Iran is obviously a glue between Israel and large parts of the Sunni world. Israel is also really appealing as an economic, a technology, an intellectual and scientific partner. The whole concept of startup nation, I think, is very appealing to Arab countries, either that don't have large energy reserves or beginning to think about the day after energy, when oil and gas are no longer great assets. And smaller countries like the UAE have to live more by their wits than they do by great energy deposits. So I think Israel's appealing there. I think there's some fatigue with the Palestinian issue. And there's frustration with the Palestinians. There is a sense, and Abba Eban had a good point. The Palestinians rarely miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. A lot of the Gulf countries in particular, Rabbi, I remember, as do you, what happened in 1990 and 91 when Saddam Hussein conquered Kuwait and absorbed it. Palestinians rallied to Saddam's side. They did not rally to the side of the threatened Arab countries in the vicinity of Iraq. Memories are long in the Middle East. So I think for lots of reasons, I think in the case of the UAE, obviously there was an incentive also with arms to get F-35 modern aircraft. That was seen as something. So my experience, governments do things for many reasons. Rarely do governments do something for only one reason. So I think here, there's lots of things that came together, and I end up where you began. This is a good thing.
So you think it's a game change?
No, I do not think it's a game. I mean, let me put it this way. In the good side, I think it's a significant thing, and I think other countries will gradually follow suit.
Mhm.
I don't think up at 4 Arab countries that normalized relations with Israel. I think sooner or later there will be others. The big question is whether at one point Saudi Arabia does. And my guess is that could happen. Probably will require leadership change in Saudi Arabia. But also my sense is much more than the UAE. I think it will be conditional. The UAE made it conditional on arms, also that Israel would not go ahead for several years on annexation. My guess is the Saudis, given their special obligations and responsibility for the Islamic holy places, I think they may have certain conditions having to do with Jerusalem and access to holy sites. So I think it'll happen there, but I don't think it's a game changer in the Middle East for a couple of reasons. One is it does nothing to limit the emergence of an Iranian threat, nuclear or otherwise. It does nothing to stabilize Syria, Yemen, Libya, Lebanon. And it does nothing directly to resolve the Palestinian conflict. And I still believe that the greatest threat to Israel's long-term viability as a democratic Jewish state is an unresolved Palestinian issue because of the demographic realities. What I'm hoping here, and maybe it's a hope against hope, I don't know, but you mentioned the Arab League before. The fact that the Arab League would not pass a resolution condemning what the UAE and Bahrain had done, I took as really interesting. That to me was a really welcome sign. What I'm hoping, and maybe it's a hope against hope, that a generation of Palestinians comes to understand that a Palestinian state is not going to be delivered by the Arab League. It's not going to be delivered by the United States. It's not going to be delivered by the United Nations. It's only going to be delivered by direct negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. And if that is one of the lessons that gradually emerges from this, that time is not going to solve their problem, outsiders are not going to solve their problem, only Palestinians, first by coming up with a consensus in the Palestinian world, easier said than done, and then negotiating directly with the Israelis, only in that way is there a chance of resolving this, then yes, this could be something good.
So the Middle East is now on one side, those who are normalizing the relationship, but then you also have new players in the Middle East. And then you have also Lebanon and Syria, Libya, with new players, Turkey's role in relationship to Hamas and so forth. Can you elaborate on that one? And by the way, you remember when you and I hosted President Gül, the former president of Turkey. That's an old regime.
Yeah, that was a very different Turkey, President Özal and others. Turkey was a responsible, not just ally, but it was a partner. Now Turkey is technically an ally. It's still in NATO, but it's not a partner. We shouldn't kid ourselves. Partners share values, partners share goals. Turkey increasingly does not share our values. Turkey increasingly does not share our goals. And when I say Turkey, I really mean Erdogan. This is a very different Turkey. We should have no illusions about that. So technically an ally, but in reality not a partner. Turkey is pursuing its own narrow agenda, a narrow anti-Kurdish agenda in parts of Syria. And obviously its latest cynical position on Nagorno-Karabakh is very much tied to its desire to have a certain position of influence in the Islamic world. So I think we need to have a future without illusions about Turkey. And I would not treat it in many ways as an ally. I would not provide it the most advanced weapons and so forth. Turkey is looking out for Turkey, too close to Russia, doing too many things at home and in the region that I believe are antithetical to our values and interests.
What about the new players? Remember, it was Henry Kissinger, our mentor, who managed to squeeze the Soviet Union out of the Middle East.
Yeah, but what's happened is, as
And how did we enter?
yeah, well, what's happened is the United States has pulled back from the Middle East. It began under the previous administration. It's accelerated under this administration. Now, on one hand, I'm prepared to say the United States over the last couple of decades got over-involved in the Middle East. Particularly, I think the 2003 Iraq War will go down historically as a serious, serious strategic error. But I think if there's a danger in doing too much, there's also a danger in doing too little. And I think our abandonment of the Kurds, our anxiousness to get out of Afghanistan now, this is whatever else this agreement is we've signed with the Taliban, it's not a peace agreement. It looks increasingly like an American withdrawal agreement. Our desire to draw down in Iraq, it looks to me increasingly what we want to do is withdraw, and nature abhors a vacuum. And I think what we're seeing is other players, other forces in Syria and elsewhere increasingly filling spaces left by the United States. So again, I think we overreached in the Middle East. The idea that we were going to transform the Middle East in our image in Iraq and elsewhere seemed to me to reflect a real misunderstanding of the region and what we could realistically accomplish. I think there could be a danger now that we underreach, if you will. And what we learned the hard way on 9/11 is even if we get tired of the Middle East doesn't necessarily get tired of us.
Now, I remember when it was Father Hesburgh and myself, we were the only two clergymen in the Council on Foreign Relations. You have changed so much in your 18 years, broadening the constituency, reaching out to the younger generation with all kinds of what you call global literacy programs. By the way, I highly recommend that book of yours, which is really a guideline. Every school should use it as a textbook.
From your mouth to God's ear.
And the real, I say it at our day school. I studied geography in Europe. That was part of a subject. Here in America, only social studies. No, you have to teach children. And the way you do it, we have an international program. Every time I pull in an ambassador, I pull in a consul general. So actually, that's what you're advocating in your book.
Let me say two things. One about the council. Council on Foreign Relations we're about to celebrate our 100th year next year. And we began as what you might call an elite organization. And we still do a lot of what we do for people who I would say are within the foreign policy conversation, government, academics, journalists, business, what have you. And that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And what I've tried to do over the last decade in particular is expand what it is we do. And increasingly, we want to engage with students and teachers at the high school and college level, with mayors and governors, with local journalists, but also with religious and congregational leaders, people who give sermons on a regular basis. They reach so many Americans. So my view is that we have to be a resource for people who are not in the foreign policy debate, but need to be. Because they're going to be like, again, look at where we are with the pandemic. Look at 9/11. Look at climate change. The world's going to affect us. The world matters. It's not a choice. Globalization is a reality. The choice is how we respond to it. And what I want people to be able to do is to make informed responses in their personal lives, in their political life. What's really sad, Arthur, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is right now, most high schools, most colleges, either they don't offer courses on the world, on history, on geography, or if they do, they're not required. What led me to write this book, to write The World, A Brief Introduction, is I met this young man who was about to go into his senior year at Stanford, one of the great institutions in the world, and he was going to graduate a year later without any exposure whatsoever to the world, to history, to economics, to geography. even though this world was going to affect his life and he was going to be a citizen and he was going to basically be being put in the position of then casting uninformed votes. And I think it's true. I think we need to teach people about the world. I also think we need to teach them about our democracy. The DNA of a democracy is not automatically transmitted. What you and I and others called civics is for the most part not taught anymore. So I actually think there's many educational crises in the United States, and public schools in particular are in general a crisis. Part of the crisis is what we don't teach. And I think there's a real absence in our curriculum of civics domestically and of global literacy about teaching young people about the world. And my concern is if they don't get it in schools, when are they going to get it? They're not going to get it watching the nightly news. They're not going to get it watching the morning television shows. If you go on the internet, you're going to get all sorts of junk and no one's there telling you what's serious, what's not. So I think we're making a major error of omission. Look, on Yom Kippur, as you know, when you do the Al-Chet, the last part of the Al-Chet is the sin of a confused heart. It's the sin of inaction. Have is the sin of omission, of inaction in our educational system, where we are not educating young people about the world they are entering and about the country they are inheriting.
So I have some very exciting news for you.
Okay, good. I need some good news.
And that is speaking about education. The Appeal of Conscience Foundation is launching a program for schools, Respect the Other.
Good.
Respect the Other, which is based on love your neighbor as yourself. So yes, we need to train the next generation. And therefore I highly recommend, and maybe it would be a good idea at the next occasion, at the Council of Foreign Relations, invite some secretaries of education or on a state level, superintendents. And your book is a very valuable guide because geography is not taught, and social studies doesn't mean anything. So you agree with that?
I'm in violent agreement.
Okay. Now you spoke about democracy. You know, I'm a great believer in Maimonides, the great Jewish thinker. And his approach was always the golden rule, Shvil HaZahav. Unfortunately, today, all over the world, not in the United States, but also Europe, all over, you find that the central golden rule is not prevailing. And I believe, and I know whether you agree, that democracy flourishes most if the Shvil HaZahav is operative. What's your comment on that one?
From 1945, particularly from 1990 to about 2005, democracy was increasing around the world. Every index, every measure of democracy, the arrows were all going in the right direction. But for the last 15 years, we're seeing something of a backsliding. We're seeing what some people call a democracy recession. And it's true. We're seeing it within countries. We're seeing countries that we hope would open up become even more closed, Russia, China. Even in our own country, I would argue that institutions are being challenged, the media, the courts. We'll see what happens with our elections over the next month. And the lesson I take is you can't take democracy for granted. It has to be constantly nurtured. And I think also in times of difficulty, you know this from history, whether it's depressions or recessions, at times of economic difficulty, times where people feel threatened, times where people don't feel opportunity, they're more willing to put aside democratic concerns and see them as luxuries rather than as necessities. And I think we're seeing that in many countries around the world, and lots of leaders are all too willing to make appeals to populism, nationalism, and the like, and to give democratic values short shrift. And what I, at the risk of making this more political than you're probably comfortable with, but we have got to be an example. I thought Reagan had it exactly right, and I was lucky enough, I worked for Ronald Reagan. He was one of the presidents I worked for. but the whole idea of America as a shining city on a hill. Yeah, we have got to be an example. We have got to be a bright, shining light so others will see a successful democracy, see the benefits that accrue from it. And also, if we walk the walk, then we can talk the talk. Then we can go around the world and make the case for it. So I think there's a lot of, in some ways, there's pressure on us to succeed if we want to influence others. And I would simply say we have got to do a lot better. The good news is we can do a lot better.
Speaking about democracy and success of democracy, we just mourned the loss of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And we've seen some other developments that has been very favorable. How do you feel in terms of the rise of anti-Semitism and xenophobia, which particularly for someone like myself, a Holocaust survivor, is a cancer that has metastasized, a virus that has been spreading all over?
Look, I won't say like you because you've had experiences I have not had, but we're seeing it again. We're seeing a revival of it. Again, you see it in times of economic dislocation. You see it in a time where societies are looking to scapegoat. The internet has become, it's both a wonderful and a terrible domain. Terrible things are said there, and the anonymity of the internet, I think, has proven to be a really unfortunate feature in allowing all sorts of trafficking of all sorts of distorted and perverted ideas to gain traction. Again, we don't educate well enough in our schools. So again, it's almost like other scourges, Rabbi, whether, we've talked about terrorism, we've talked about infectious disease. The lesson I take from history is these are all I've often made the comparison between terrorism and an infectious disease, and anti-Semitism, also some similarities. I don't think you ever eradicate it. I think we limit it, we push it back. But what history suggests is it comes out of the woodwork at certain moments. And it's coming out of the woodwork again. And it's essential that leadership have zero tolerance for it. And again, at the risk of being political, I think our leadership has shown unfortunate tolerance for it.
By the way, I don't like the word tolerance. And I convinced the Secretary General to use mutual acceptance in term. And the reason I do not like the word tolerance, if I tolerate you, then I'm superior and you're inferior. So I don't know whether you want to change from tolerance to mutual acceptance, but
there's nothing mutual here. What I don't want to see is anyone in any way signal in any way whatsoever that among other things, anti-Semitism is in any way acceptable in any form. I think we have got to be, I'm not normally a person of absolutes, but on things like racism or anti-Semitism, I think we need to be, we can't provide openings because it will, to use your words, it will metastasize. So in that sense, we have to be, I'll use the word intolerant, and we have to be, we cannot in any way look the other way. Again, inaction in the face of certain kinds of threats is morally unacceptable.
Now, you remember the historic visit of Pope Benedict at Parky Synagogue in 2008. You were there. And what is the role of the religious leadership? What should it be? What can it be at this juncture in history?
Look, I think religious leadership has tremendous access to people. I mentioned before sermons. I don't know the latest statistics, but tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in this and other countries every week go to a house of worship, whether it's a church, a synagogue, a mosque, what have you. So religious leaders, congregational leaders are also thought leaders. And what it is they say, what it is they don't say has real implications and repercussions. So I think the greatest contribution of congregational and religious leaders is to make the case, what you call the golden rule, for, again, openness. You don't like the word tolerance in certain ways, but you know what I'm talking about. To make the case for opposition to discrimination. I'll take an issue, for example, now. Let's get political for a second. I think one of the real threats to the future is climate change. I would love for religious leaders to play a larger role there. God created the heavens and the earth. We are the custodians of the heavens and the earth. I would love for religious leaders of every faith to be much stronger in talking to members of their congregations about this. That to me is a major opportunity to have an important impact. Now, religious leaders can also work at the level you work at with the appeal of conscience and so forth. And you can do things at that level. And I think that's important. But quite honestly, I think the most important thing religious leaders can do is be teachers, in the best sense of the word, rabbi, with those who are in their congregations, and about attitudes, values, ideas, and so forth. And so I would say I think religious leaders have tremendous potential to make a difference.
Well, we've come a long way when you look at the relationship between the Catholic Church and Judaism. Historically, it was a very difficult relationship. And so I believe that the crisis that the world is facing today is really a great opportunity, and many religious leaders are using it. And I'm so glad that you incorporated this special program, interacting with religious leaders, which really was a novel approach at the Council of Foreign Relations.
Yeah, it all came about because one day I was reading and I heard that, I can't remember the number, it was something like 100 million or more Americans every weekend went to a house of worship. Mm-hmm. And I went, wow, a couple of million people watch the nightly news or watch the morning shows. The New York Times or whatever has a circulation of 1 or 2 million people. But the idea that 100 or 150 million people every week would go into a house of worship and hear a sermon. And I'm not sure, Rabbi, forgive me, what percentage of them actually stay awake during the sermon, but that's a different statistic. But let's say it's a high percentage. That to me is a major teaching opportunity. And unlike school, which we tend to limit to the young, what's so special also about houses of worship, that's lifelong. We go regularly, whether it's Shabbat for Jews or Sundays for Christians or Friday for Muslims. That's a lifelong weekly opportunity to have a conversation. That to me is it's a major. I think it's a major force in societies around the world.
Now, you and I are very, very proud New Yorkers, not only globalists. Are you predicting a reemergence like after 9/11? And a return to the city, or are we going to see a exodus, which we have experienced to suburbia and to rural life?
The honest answer is it depends. In order for people not to exit, in order for people to stay or come, New York has to be safe, has to be physically safe in terms of disease, has to be safe in terms of crime. I believe there has to be economic opportunity. Taxes have to be at a level that are affordable. Housing has to be affordable. Mass transit has to be operating. I think New York faces enormous difficulties, I'll be honest. And if there is a revival or a return or a bounce back, whatever image you want to use, my own view is it's going to be slow and it's not automatic. I think we're likely to be living everywhere in a world of managed risk with this virus for some time. New York, with certain exceptions, has done better after a terrible start. But I think it's going to be difficult. I think this is actually more serious than what New York went through in the 70s. And I think the next, just like this presidential election, I think is truly consequential for the country. I think the next mayoral election, just over a year from now, is truly consequential for the city of New York. But at the moment, I don't see the elements of a compact. I don't see the elements of a civic consensus about something that New Yorkers of various political approaches could rally around. So I'm not going to say, it's always a mistake to bet against New York, except the Knicks. I think it's safe to bet against the Knicks. That's a different issue. But I think about betting against the New York, I think it depends. And look, the good news is New York can turn it around, but it's not just going to happen. I think it's wrong to be sanguine. I don't think one can sit back and think that, and that's true of New York, it's true of the country, it's true of the world. I've come to think that it's dangerous to be sanguine. Good things don't just happen. They're not the natural lesson of history is things just don't work out on their own, but they work out because people of goodwill and capability with resources come together. And so what happens in New York, I think, is New York's future is to be determined.
75 years ago, at Lake Success, United Nations, after World War II, a push for human rights against genocide. Actually, the term genocide started after World War II, after the Holocaust. What do you think about the United Nations today?
You're not going to like my answer, so you'll probably, you can withdraw the question if you want. Look, the UN, I just wrote a piece for this international syndicate I write for called Unhappy 75th Birthday. Look, my bottom line is the major powers get the UN they want, not the UN the world needs. The UN has never been more than the major powers were prepared to let it be. And that remains the case today. So I don't sit where I sit and rant against the UN for all of its flaws and imperfections and weaknesses. Essentially, the UN is what the United States and the other major powers, Russia, China, the Europeans, are prepared to let it be. And the answer is not much. Everyone's in favor of the UN in principle, but not in practice when the UN acts against what they see as their national interest. My view is what happens as a result is that the world will still find ways, limited ways of coming together. It's just not going to be at the UN. The UN is a kind of universal approach to multilateralism. There's very few issues where 193 or whatever the number is this week, countries can agree on anything. The last round of global trade talks failed. The climate talks have not amounted to much. So my sense is the future of multilateralism will not be UN based, but rather we'll have smaller groupings of countries and other entities, could be businesses, could be others, foundations, that'll come together where they agree, they matter, they're relevant, they have resources, they're willing to contribute to work on specific problems. So I think we'll have a kind of designer or functional multilateralism, but I don't think the UN is going to be the center of much.
So you think it's going to be a decentralization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, I wouldn't argue for abolishing the UN, but I think we got to be realistic about its impact. I think it's quite limited. And I think what'll happen is either the great powers will agree, but more likely they won't. So what I think, for example, if you want something on climate, what might have to happen in the first instance is the United States, Europeans, some Asians will have to agree on some new rules or on how to structure cyberspace. The Chinese and Russians are not going to agree as authoritarian systems. We're going to have to do it with the other democracies in the first instance. I don't know if we can agree on rules for a World Health Organization reform. If not, we may have to create something on HIV/AIDS, if you will recall. The answer was to create new institutions that existed alongside the World Health Organization. I think we have to be, what's the word, pragmatic, flexible, and not equate multilateralism with UNism. UN is one venue, but in most cases, it won't be the most significant venue.
You received the Presidential Citizen Medal from President George Bush, 41, HW, yeah.
HW.
Yeah. You have many of his personal notes handwritten?
I do.
Anyhow, I have a whole collection of them. Anyhow, so my question to you is, in 91, he proclaimed the New World Order. And you made reference about the world being in disorder, okay? What is your prediction in terms of what will emerge Are we going to have a new world order?
I'm skeptical. Look, let me say two or three things in answer to your question. I'm not going to evade your question. One is there's virtually nothing in history that's inevitable. So the reason I can't answer your question, to be intellectually honest, is there's nothing that's baked into the cake. No one could stand here tonight and say, this is impossible, or this is definite. Nothing's inevitable. It just depends. It depends. No, but it depends more than anything else on the United States. We can't do it alone, but it's not going to happen without us. In that sense, Madeleine Albright was right. I don't much like us running around the world calling ourselves indispensable. It sounds conceited and arrogant. I'd like others to describe us that way. But the answer is not a lot's going to happen without us. And at the moment, it's not clear we're prepared to play the kind of role we've played for the last 75 years. So that to me is that's a real cloud over the future. The rise of, the growing strength of authoritarian regimes is a cloud. The difficulty of some of these global issues that has emerged is another real problem. We don't have institutions to deal with cyberspace or to deal with climate change. What we have is woefully inadequate. So it will take major intellectual and major political effort. So I'm worried. I mean, it's now 3 decades after President Bush 41 declared a new world order. And I would simply say, Arthur, that I don't think we have much to show for these 3 decades. It is a really disappointing moment of history. It's been a really disappointing moment for American foreign policy these 30 years. I think in many ways we've squandered our opportunity. Good news, it's not too late. Bad news is we don't have a lot to show for 30 years of the kind of advantage. Let me give you a comparison. We emerged once before with enormous advantage in absolute and relative terms. When was it? After World War II. After World War II, under Truman, the United States emerged with tremendous possibilities. And for the most part, it translated those possibilities into realities. It was an extraordinary era of creativity. Indeed, Dean Acheson, as you know, titled his memoir, Present at the Creation. I don't see anything, for the most part, comparable to that after the end of the Cold War. So I think historians will be critical of the United States for some of the things we did, like Iraq. But I think they'll mainly be critical of the United States for what we didn't do. That we had a real chance to begin to build new institutions to deal with the modern world, and essentially we didn't do it. We got distracted, we frittered away our time and energy on second or third order questions. We didn't address some of our domestic needs. So I think history will rightfully be very critical of largely what we didn't do. Good news is the opportunity has not disappeared. Bad news is the opportunity isn't growing with time. We have got to seize it while it's still there.
You know, I've admired you not only as a dedicated public servant to the United States for your intellect, and not too many people know that you were a Rhodes Scholar, PhD from Oxford, a peacemaker in Northern Ireland, and so on and so on. But Richard, I've admired you above all, and you and Susan. You are good parents. You have instilled values into your son and daughter. That's really, you gave them the faith to meet their life with hope and future and faith. So my question to you is, I know what you wish for your children, but what kind of world should they be prepared for?
Well, one, I owe a bit of thanks to you all because they both got their religious education at Park East. And so thank you for that. Look, all parents, we all wish upward mobility. We all want tomorrow to be better than today. And my generation, I'm a few decades south of you in terms of age. I think you've got a good 2 decades on me. Those of us who are baby boomers, we've had an extraordinarily fortunate existence. If you look at the United States, say, of 1950 and what's happened over the last 70 years, it's really been a remarkable run. And in many ways, life has improved materially and other ways as well. And what we obviously wish for our kids is they come of age in a world that's safe, where war is not a defining reality where other global challenges are not overwhelming the country. We want it to be stable, safe, and so forth, where opportunity is real. And I worry about that. I think what we've learned in the last couple of years is not to take any of these things for granted. And I think for this younger generation, whether it was 9/11 or now COVID-19, I think they've gotten a couple of pretty tough introductions to life. It's thrown them all a bit for a loop, and nothing's certain, whether it was planning for careers or planning for relationships or whatever. So I think they've had a rougher start than my generation did. So, so obviously, so when I look out and I look at things like disease or climate change or the possibility of conflict somewhere, and I look at some of the domestic problems we face, which are many and real, yeah, like any other parent, I worry. I don't want the last 70 years to be seen as the golden age. I want the next 70 years to be seen as the golden age. But I come back to the same point. It won't just happen. It will only happen if we collectively make it happen. And I never give up, and I haven't given up, but I am not sanguine. And not being sanguine, by the way, is a good thing. If you're not sanguine, you're more likely to be active.
I think you've also taught them, Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Do not separate yourself from the community.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's also the truth in international relations.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I would just simply say one of the most common phrases in my business is international community. And I would simply say that in most instances, I find it more aspirational than real. And one way to think about one's work in the future is how do you make the idea of an international community less aspirational and more actual? So we do come together to deal with some of the collective challenges. It's not a bad way to define the task.
You mentioned before about the preacher and the audience falling asleep. So I'm telling you, this is not okay. This is not Parkey Synagogue, but it's a true story. In the midst of a sermon, a member of the congregation fell asleep and started snoring. Okay, and then walked out. So his wife was very, very apologetic, and she said, "I'm so sorry, but my husband is a sleepwalker."
Not bad.
I want to say that no one fell asleep as a result of this dialogue tonight. Okay.
We don't know. One of the advantages of Zoom is we wouldn't know.
And so, first of all, I wish you above all that every parent aspires for. Nachat.
Toda rabah.
Have a great deal of nachat from you and Susan, from your children. Okay.
Thank you.
I still remember the bar mitzvah with Pete Peterson in the back, and all your Council of Foreign Relation leadership. Really, it's a tribute.
May he rest in peace. But have a Shana Tova Metuka, Rabbi.
Shana Tova, and go from strength to strength in your what I call your mission. You have a sacred mission.
Well, I don't know if it's sacred, but it's a mission.
Okay. God bless. Thank you.
Be well. Thank you.